close your eyes and imagine a world that existed long before the first dinosaur ever walked the earth. A world so ancient, so alien, that if you were dropped there right now, you wouldn't recognize a single thing. The sky hangs heavy with reddish dust. The air tastes different, thick and strange in your lungs. The ground beneath your feet is cracked and dry, stretching endlessly in every direction. There are no birds calling overhead, no mammals scurrying through the underbrush. No flowers blooming in the wasteland. What you'd hear instead would chill you to the bone, the scrape of massive claws against stone, the hiss of something breathing in the shadows, the sudden terrible silence that comes right before something strikes. Welcome to the Permian period, a chapter of Earth's history that lasted from about 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago. This is the story of the monsters that ruled this world. Real monsters, creatures so bizarre, so terrifying that they make dinosaurs look ordinary by comparison. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Most people have never heard of them. While everyone knows about Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor, these older, stranger beasts remain hidden in the shadows of deep time. But not anymore. You're about to meet them. The world of the Permian was dominated by a single massive landmass called Pangea. Every continent you know today, every piece of land on Earth was smashed together into one gigantic supercontinent. Imagine standing in what would one day become New York and being able to walk without crossing any ocean all the way to what would become Morocco or China or South Africa. That was Pangea. And it was a harsh place to live. The interior of this supercontinent was one of the driest places Earth has ever known. Deserts stretched for thousands of miles. Dust storms raged for weeks. The temperatures swung wildly between scorching days and freezing nights. Rivers carved through the landscape, creating temporary oases of life, but they were few and far between. The forests that did exist looked nothing like the forests you know. There were no oak trees, no pines in the modern sense. Instead, the land was covered with strange seed ferns, primitive conifers, and massive club mosses. These plants created twisted, shallow forests that provided cover for the hunters lurking within. And the hunters were unlike anything that came before or after. Let's start with the creature that has become the icon of the Permian. Even though most people who see it think it's a dinosaur, they're wrong. It lived tens of millions of years before the first dinosaur ever existed. Its name is Dimetrodon, and when you see its skeleton in a museum, one thing immediately catches your eye. The sail, that massive, beautiful, terrifying sail rising from its back like the fin of some ancient dragon. Picture this animal in life. You're standing at the edge of a muddy riverbank in what will one day be Texas, but right now it's part of the western coast of Pangea. The sun is just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of deep red and orange. The air is cool, almost cold, and there, basking on a flat rock near the water's edge, is something that makes you freeze in place. It's huge. From nose to tail, it stretches about 13 feet, longer than most cars. Its body is thick and powerful, built low to the ground. Its legs splay out to the sides in that distinctive sprawling posture you see in modern lizards and crocodiles. The skin is rough, probably covered in small scales, maybe with patterns that help it blend into the dried grasses and reddish soil. But it's the sail that captures your attention and won't let go. Rising from its back, supported by elongated extensions of its vertebrae, this sail stands over 3 feet tall at its highest point. Thin skin stretches between the spines, and in the early morning light you can see the blood vessels running through it, creating a network of dark lines against the translucent membrane. Why did Dimetrodon have this sail? Scientists have debated this question for decades, and the most widely accepted answer has to do with temperature. You see, Dimetrodon was a synapsid, an early member of the lineage that would eventually give rise to mammals. But it wasn't a mammal itself. It couldn't generate body heat internally the way you do. Like modern reptiles, it was ectothermic, dependent on external heat sources to warm its body. And here's where the sail becomes brilliant. That large surface area, packed with blood vessels, acts like a solar panel. When Dimetrodon turns its body to face the sun, blood flowing through the sail warms up quickly. That heated blood then circulates through the rest of the body, raising its core temperature much faster than would be possible without the sail. This gave Dimetrodon a crucial advantage. While other predators were still sluggish and slow in the cool morning air, Dimetrodon could be warm, active, and hunting. But the sail wasn't just for heating. At the end of a hot day, when the Permian sun had baked the landscape, Dimetrodon could use that same sail to cool down. By positioning itself in the shade or facing away from the sun, the blood in the sail would cool, helping to prevent overheating. Some scientists think the sail also served social purposes. Maybe males with larger, more impressive sails attracted more mates. Maybe the sail could flush with colour during mating season or territorial disputes, sending visual signals to other Dimetrodon. We'll never know for certain, but the possibility adds another layer of complexity to this ancient predator. Now, let's talk about what made Dimetrodon truly dangerous. Its teeth. Open your hand and look at your teeth in a mirror. Notice how they're all different. You have incisors in front for cutting, canines for tearing, and molars in back for grinding. This variety in tooth types is called heterodonty, and it's a hallmark of mammals and their ancestors. Dimetrodon had heterodonty too. Its name literally means two types of teeth. At the front of its jaws were sharp, pointed teeth for grabbing prey, but further back it had larger, serrated teeth designed for slicing through flesh and bone. These teeth could pierce, hold, cut, and tear, all in one terrible bite. The skull of Dimetrodon was massive and powerful. Deep attachment points for jaw muscles meant it could bite with tremendous force. When it caught prey, there was no escape. Those jaws would clamp down, the serrated teeth would saw through skin and muscle, and the victim's fate was sealed. What did Dimetrodon hunt? In the early Permian swamps and riverbanks where it lived, it was the apex predator. It hunted other synapsids, early reptiles, large amphibians, anything it could catch. Some Dimetrodon fossils have been found with bones of other animals preserved in their stomach area, giving us direct evidence of their diet. But here's something that makes Dimetrodon even more fascinating. It wasn't just a mindless eating machine. Its skull had a relatively large brain case for its time. The portions of the brain associated with sense of smell were well developed. This was a hunter that could track prey, that could learn, that could remember where water sources were and where prey animals gathered. Imagine being a smaller synapsid in this world, maybe something the size of a large dog. You come down to the river to drink. The water is murky, brown with sediment. You're nervous, alert. Every instinct you have is screaming that this is dangerous, and you're right to be afraid. Dimetrodon has been lying perfectly still in the shallow water, just its eyes and the tip of its snout above the surface. Its sail is submerged, invisible. It has been waiting for hours, absolutely motionless. It saw you coming long before you saw it. Your scent reached its nostrils when you were still 50 feet away. You take one step into the water. That's all it needed. The water explodes in a thrash of movement. Dimetrodon's powerful body surges forward, its jaws gaping wide. You try to run, but the soft mud at the water's edge grabs your feet. The teeth close around your ribcage. The force of the bite cracks bone. It's over in seconds. This scene played out countless times across the Permian landscape. Dimetrodon reigned supreme for millions of years, one of the most successful predators of its era. Fossils have been found across what is now the southwestern United States and parts of Europe, areas that were all connected in Pangea during the Permian. Different species of Dimetrodon evolved, each slightly different in size and build. Dimetrodon grandis was one of the largest, reaching that full 13-foot length. Dimetrodon limbatus was smaller but possibly faster. Dimetrodon milleri had a distinctively shaped skull. These different species occupied slightly different ecological niches, hunting different prey or using different hunting strategies. And then, as the Permian period progressed, the climate changed. The once lush swamps began to dry up. Rivers became seasonal instead of permanent. The landscape transformed into something harsher, more arid. New predators began to emerge, predators even more fearsome than Dimetrodon. Which brings us to the late Permian period, to the southern regions of Pangea, to the ancient land of Gondwana. The air here is different, drier. The vegetation is sparser, more spread out. The animals have changed too, evolved new strategies for survival in this harsher world. And walking through this landscape is something that would make even Dimetrodon flee in terror. The Gorgonopsids had arrived. If you saw a Gorgonopsid for the first time, your mind would struggle to categorize it. It's not quite like anything alive today. The body has elements of a big cat, the head suggests a reptile, but there's something else there too, something uniquely its own. The name Gorgonopsid comes from Greek mythology. The Gorgons were three sisters, monsters so hideous that anyone who looked at them turned to stone. Medusa was the most famous, with her hair of living snakes and her gaze that could petrify. When scientists first discovered these Permian predators, they thought the name fit perfectly. These were creatures that could turn you to stone with fear. The largest Gorgonopsids were massive. Species like Inostrancevia could reach over 12 feet in length and stand nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder. Their bodies were built for power and speed. Unlike the sprawling posture of Dimetrodon, Gorgonopsids had a more upright stance. Their legs tucked more directly under their bodies, giving them better leverage and allowing for faster running. This was a crucial evolutionary innovation. Think about how a lizard runs versus how a dog runs. The lizard, with its legs splayed out to the sides, has to waste energy lifting its entire body off the ground with each step. A dog, with legs directly beneath it, can run much more efficiently. The Gorgonopsids were moving toward that more efficient design, but let's talk about the feature that truly defined these animals: the teeth. Gorgonopsids had the most impressive canine teeth of any synapsid that ever lived. These weren't just teeth, they were weapons, saber-like fangs that could grow over 4 inches long, protruding down from the upper jaw like curved daggers. The roots of these teeth were incredibly deep, anchored firmly in the skull to withstand the tremendous forces they would experience when striking prey. The teeth were slightly flattened from side to side and had sharp edges along the front and back. Some species had subtle serrations along these edges, like a steak knife. This design meant the teeth didn't just pierce, they sliced. When a Gorgonopsid bit down, these fangs would sink deep into the victim's body, cutting through skin, muscle, blood vessels, and organs. The lower jaw had a remarkable adaptation too. There was a flexible joint that allowed the jaw to open incredibly wide. This meant a Gorgonopsid could position its head and open its mouth at an angle that let those massive canines clear the lower jaw and strike deep into the target. It's similar to how modern snakes can unhinge their jaws, though not quite as extreme. Picture the hunting strategy. You're a dicynodont, a pig-sized herbivore with a turtle-like beak and a pair of tusks. You're part of a small herd grazing on the tough vegetation of the late Permian savanna. The dry season has been hard. Food is scarce. Your group is spread out, each animal focused on finding enough to eat. You don't notice that you've wandered too far from the others. You don't see the shape lying flat in the tall, dried grass 30 feet away. The Gorgonopsid has been tracking your herd for hours, watching, waiting for exactly this moment. It doesn't make a sound as it begins to move. Its body is low to the ground, each paw placed carefully to avoid crunching the dried vegetation. Its eyes never leave you. Those eyes are positioned more toward the front of the skull than in most Permian animals, giving it better depth perception. It can judge distance with deadly accuracy. 20 feet, 15 feet, you're still unaware, still focused on the plant you're chewing. 10 feet, the Gorgonopsid's muscles coil like springs. 5 feet, you hear something, start to turn your head. Too late. The Gorgonopsid explodes from cover in a burst of speed that would rival a modern big cat. It covers those last 5 feet in less than a second. You try to run, but there's no time. The massive predator slams into you with the force of a freight train, and in the same instant the jaws open wide and those terrible fangs drive deep into your neck. The canines penetrate between your vertebrae, severing the spinal cord. The massive jaw muscles clamp down with thousands of pounds of force. You feel nothing after that first instant. It's over. That was the reality of life in the late Permian. The Gorgonopsids were the supreme predators of their time and place. Multiple genera have been discovered, each with slight variations. Gorgonops itself, the namesake of the group, was one of the earlier and smaller forms. Lycaonops was more lightly built, possibly a faster runner. Rubigea was one of the last and largest, a true giant. These animals spread across what would become Russia, South Africa, Tanzania, and parts of China. Wherever they lived, they were at the top of the food chain. Nothing hunted them. They hunted everything else. The fossil evidence tells us something remarkable about how Gorgonopsids lived. They weren't just solitary killers stalking the Permian plains alone. Some sites have revealed multiple individuals buried together, suggesting they may have lived in family groups or even hunted cooperatively. This would make them even more formidable than we first imagined. Think about what cooperative hunting means. Modern wolves do it. Lions do it. A single wolf can take down prey its own size, maybe a bit larger, but a pack of wolves working together can bring down an elk or even a moose, animals many times larger than any individual wolf. If Gorgonopsids hunted in groups, even the largest herbivores of the Permian would have been vulnerable. The brain case of Gorgonopsids shows something interesting too. The regions associated with smell and hearing were well developed. These were animals with acute senses, able to detect prey from great distances. On a still night on the Permian savanna, a Gorgonopsid might smell a herd of dicynodonts from over a mile away. The faint sound of their movements, the rustle of vegetation as they fed, would carry on the dry air. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. The skeleton of Gorgonopsids shows signs of rapid growth, similar to what we see in warm-blooded animals. The bone structure has characteristics that suggest a high metabolism. Now, we can't say for certain that Gorgonopsids were warm-blooded in the way mammals are, but they were likely somewhere on that spectrum. Not quite cold-blooded like a lizard, not quite warm-blooded like you, but something in between. This matters because it would have given them another advantage. A truly cold-blooded predator becomes sluggish when temperatures drop, but if Gorgonopsids could maintain a somewhat elevated body temperature, they could hunt effectively even during the cool Permian nights. Imagine being an herbivore trying to sleep, thinking you're safe in the darkness, and then suddenly those fangs are in your throat. The Gorgonopsids ruled the late Permian for millions of years, but they weren't the only terrors walking the earth. In other parts of Pangea, different monsters had evolved their own deadly strategies. Travel with me now to what will one day be southern Africa. The landscape here in the middle Permian is a vast floodplain cut through by massive rivers that swell and shrink with the seasons. When the rains come, this region transforms into a network of lakes and wetlands. When the dry season arrives, the water retreats, leaving behind cracked mud and scattered waterholes. And ruling over this landscape, feared by everything else that lives here, is a predator that makes the Gorgonopsids look almost delicate by comparison. Anteosaurus. The name means earlier lizard, though that's almost an insult to this magnificent beast. Anteosaurus wasn't just a predator, it was a force of nature, a walking catastrophe for anything unfortunate enough to be nearby when it decided to hunt. Let's talk about size first, because size matters when you're trying to understand just how terrifying this animal was. The largest Anteosaurus specimens found so far suggest an animal around 16 feet long from nose to tail tip, standing about 4.5 feet tall at the shoulder. The weight estimates vary, but most paleontologists agree on something around 1,100 pounds, possibly more for the largest individuals. To put that in perspective, that's about the same weight as a modern grizzly bear, but distributed across a much longer, lower body. Imagine a grizzly bear that's been stretched out, given a massive tail, and equipped with jaws that could crack bone like you crack a nut. The skull alone tells you everything you need to know about what kind of animal this was. An adult Anteosaurus skull could exceed 31 inches in length. That's longer than the distance from your elbow to your fingertips. And it's not a delicate skull. The bones are thick, heavily reinforced, built to withstand tremendous impacts. Why would a predator need such a thick skull? The answer becomes clear when you look at the top and sides of the skull. They show a pattern of thickened bone, rough patches, and sometimes even signs of healed injuries. Anteosaurus used its head as a weapon, ramming other Anteosaurus in brutal combat over territory and mates. Picture two male Anteosaurus meeting at the boundary of their territories. It's the dry season, and good hunting grounds are scarce. Both animals are hungry, both are aggressive. They approach each other slowly, heads lowered, making themselves look as large and threatening as possible. Maybe there's some bellowing, some display behavior we can only guess at. And then they charge, over a ton of muscle and bone and fury, accelerating across the hard-packed earth. The sound when their skulls collide must have been incredible, like two boulders smashing together. The impact would have been felt through their entire bodies. But those reinforced skulls could take it. They were designed for exactly this kind of punishment. The confrontation might last for minutes or even hours, charge after charge, each animal trying to prove its dominance. Eventually, one would give up, retreat, live to fight another day. The winner would claim the territory and all the prey within it. But Anteosaurus didn't reserve its aggression for other members of its own species. It was the apex predator of its ecosystem, and its hunting strategy was based on overwhelming power and surprise. The teeth of Anteosaurus were different from those of the Gorgonopsids. Instead of those massive saber fangs, Anteosaurus had a more generalized set of sharp, serrated teeth. The canines were prominent but not extremely elongated. The teeth further back in the jaw were designed for cutting and tearing. This was a predator that relied on the crushing power of its bite as much as the sharpness of its teeth. The jaw muscles were phenomenally strong. Attachment points on the skull show where massive muscles connected, muscles capable of generating bite forces that would rival those of large crocodiles. When Anteosaurus bit down on something, bones broke, flesh tore. There was no struggling free. The body was built for power rather than speed. The limbs were thick and muscular, positioned in a semi-upright stance that was more advanced than Dimetrodon, but not as upright as the Gorgonopsids. This gave Anteosaurus a combination of stability and power. It could move when it needed to, could even run in short bursts, but its real strength was in that massive build. Hunting for Anteosaurus was probably an ambush affair. Unlike the Gorgonopsids that might chase prey across open ground, Anteosaurus would use stealth and terrain to get close before striking. Let's watch a hunt unfold. The location is a waterhole in the late afternoon. The dry season has been going on for months now. This waterhole is one of the few remaining sources of water for miles around. Animals have to come here to drink, even though they know it's dangerous. Anteosaurus arrived at this waterhole before dawn, moving slowly and carefully despite its size. It positioned itself among a stand of primitive conifers about 40 feet from the water's edge. Then it settled down to wait. The heat of the day climbed. Insects buzzed. Small reptiles scurried past. Anteosaurus didn't move. Patience was as much a weapon as those terrible jaws. As the afternoon wears on, animals begin to arrive. First come the smaller creatures, quick and nervous. They drink fast and leave. Anteosaurus lets them go. It's waiting for something bigger, something worth the explosive burst of energy a kill will require. Then they arrive, a small group of Titanocephalus, large herbivorous synapsids with thick skulls and massive bodies. They're cautious, scanning the area around the waterhole, but they're desperately thirsty. Eventually, need overcomes fear. The largest one approaches the water's edge. The others follow. They begin to drink. Heads down, focused on the water, guard temporarily lowered. This is the moment. Anteosaurus erupts from cover like a landslide coming to life. Those powerful legs drive its massive body forward with shocking speed. The Titanocephalus look up in terror, but they're too slow, too late. Anteosaurus crosses those 40 feet in seconds. The jaws open wide. The attack is aimed not at the neck like a Gorgonopsid might do, but at the body, at the rib cage. The teeth close around the victim's midsection, and the full power of that bite is unleashed. Ribs crack and break. Internal organs are crushed. The force of the impact knocks the Titanocephalus off its feet. The other herbivores scatter in panic, but Anteosaurus ignores them. It has its prey. The struggling weakens and stops. The hunt is over. This scene repeated itself across the Permian landscape wherever Anteosaurus lived. Fossils have been found primarily in what is now South Africa, in rock formations that preserve an incredible window into this ancient world. The Beaufort Group formations have yielded not just Anteosaurus, but dozens of other Permian species, creating a detailed picture of the ecosystem. And what an ecosystem it was. Anteosaurus shared its world with a variety of prey species. Besides Titanocephalus, there were various Dicynodonts, those strange beaked herbivores that were so successful during the Permian. There were smaller predatory synapsids too, though none that could challenge an adult Anteosaurus. The climate where Anteosaurus lived was seasonal. During the wet season, the region would be relatively lush with rivers flowing and vegetation growing thick, but the dry season was harsh. Temperatures soared during the day, water became scarce, food became harder to find. This is where being the apex predator had its advantages. Anteosaurus could take down the largest prey, meaning it could go longer between kills than smaller predators. But being at the top of the food chain didn't mean life was easy. An adult Anteosaurus would have needed to consume enormous amounts of food to maintain that massive body. During lean times, hunger would have been a constant companion. The competition with other Anteosaurus for hunting grounds would have been fierce. Young Anteosaurus faced even more challenges. When they hatched or were born, we're not entirely sure which, they would have been vulnerable. Too small to defend themselves, too slow to run from threats. Many would have died young, falling prey to smaller, more agile predators, or even to other Anteosaurus. The ones that survived to adulthood, though, became rulers of their domain. The thick skull would develop over years, reinforced by countless small impacts and the pressure of powerful jaw muscles. The teeth would grow large and sharp, capable of piercing the thickest hide. The body would pack on muscle and mass until the animal became a walking fortress. Anteosaurus was part of a larger group called the Dinocephalians, which literally means terrible heads. The name is apt. These were animals that, across multiple species and genera, shared that characteristic of having massive, thick-skulled heads that they used both for hunting and for fighting each other. Titanophonius, which we'll meet later, was another member of this group. So was Moschops, though it took that skull reinforcement in a different direction. The Dinocephalians represented an early peak in synapsid evolution. They were some of the first really large land predators, the first to develop sophisticated hunting strategies and complex social behaviors. They proved that the synapsid lineage, the line that would eventually lead to mammals, could produce animals just as impressive and fearsome as anything that would come later. But the reign of Anteosaurus, like that of all the Permian monsters, was not destined to last forever. The climate was changing, the world was shifting, new challenges were coming, challenges that even these apex predators might not be able to overcome. But not all the monsters of the Permian lived exclusively on land. Some ruled the boundary between water and earth, moving effortlessly between two worlds that most creatures could only master one of. These were the amphibian terrors, and they deserve your attention just as much as the synapsid predators we've been discussing. Let's shift our focus now to the river systems and swamps of the early Permian, roughly 295 million years ago. The location is what will one day be Texas and Oklahoma, but right now it's a coastal floodplain at the edge of a shallow sea. Rivers meander through the landscape, their courses changing with every flood season. Swamps form in the low-lying areas, creating environments thick with vegetation and teeming with life. This is the domain of Eriops. If you encountered Eriops on land, you might think it was moving slowly, almost clumsily. Its body is low and heavy, dragging along the ground. Those thick legs seem to struggle with the weight they're carrying. You might be tempted to think this animal is vulnerable, an easy target. You would be catastrophically wrong, because you've made the mistake of judging Eriops on land, and Eriops is not primarily a land animal. The moment it slides into the water, everything changes. In the water, Eriops transforms. That heavy body becomes buoyant, supported by the liquid around it. That thick tail, which seemed awkward on land, becomes a powerful propeller, driving it through the water with surprising speed. Those legs, no longer fighting gravity, can paddle efficiently. The clumsy-looking beast is suddenly a deadly efficient predator. Eriops was massive for an amphibian. The largest specimens reached about 6.5 feet in length and weighed close to 200 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's about 3 times the length of the largest salamander alive today, and many times heavier. This was not some timid little frog hiding under a lily pad. This was an apex predator in its aquatic environment. The skull of Eriops is a masterpiece of predatory design. Wide and flat, it stretches about a foot long in large adults. The bones are thick and heavily textured, giving the skull a rough, armor-like quality. But it's what's inside that skull that makes Eriops so dangerous. Open its mouth and you find yourself looking at a nightmare. Rows of sharp, conical teeth line both the upper and lower jaws. But here's the twist that makes Eriops truly unique. It also has teeth on the roof of its mouth. These palatal teeth create a cage, a trap that nothing can escape from once the jaws close. Imagine you're a primitive fish swimming in the murky waters of a Permian swamp. The water is brown with sediment, limiting visibility to just a few feet. You're searching for food, maybe smaller fish or invertebrates stirring up the bottom mud. You don't notice the shape lying perfectly still on the bottom, half buried in the silt. That shape is Eriops. Its eyes are positioned on top of its head, allowing it to watch the water above while remaining completely submerged. Its skin is mottled brown and green, blending perfectly with the algae-covered rocks and mud of the swamp floor. It's been lying here for hours, without moving a muscle. Patience is not a virtue for Eriops. It's a hunting strategy. You swim closer. Still, Eriops doesn't move. You're now directly above it, maybe 3 feet away. Your shadow passes over its eyes. This is what it's been waiting for. The attack is explosive. Eriops lunges upward with shocking speed, jaws gaping wide. You try to dart away, but the water slows your escape. The jaws snap shut, and those teeth, both the ones on the jaws and the ones on the roof of the mouth, pierce your body from multiple angles. There's no breaking free from this grip. The teeth are angled slightly backward, designed to hold struggling prey. Eriops doesn't have to kill you immediately, it just has to hold on, and it will. It can hold its breath for an incredibly long time, far longer than you can. Eventually, the struggling stops. The prey is swallowed whole or torn into manageable chunks by those powerful jaws. But Eriops didn't spend all its time in the water. The robust bone structure tells us it could and did venture onto land. Those sturdy legs and reinforced spine weren't just for show. During the dry season, when some water sources dried up completely, Eriops might travel overland to find new ponds and streams. It could even hunt on land, though it was slower and more vulnerable there. The fossil record shows us that Eriops lived in environments that fluctuated dramatically between wet and dry conditions. The ability to operate in both water and on land was crucial for survival in such unpredictable habitats. When the rains came and the swamps expanded, Eriops thrived in the abundant water. When the dry season arrived and the swamps shrank, it could move to find new water or even burrow into the mud to wait out the drought. Eriops belonged to a group called temnospondyls, which were the dominant amphibians of the late Carboniferous and Permian periods. The temnospondyls were incredibly diverse, ranging from small salamander-sized forms to giants much larger than Eriops. They were, in many ways, the amphibian equivalent of what dinosaurs would later become for reptiles, a hugely successful group that dominated their ecological niches for tens of millions of years. What makes temnospondyls particularly interesting is that they represent a different approach to adapting to life on land compared to the synapsids and early reptiles. While synapsids and reptiles were evolving increasingly sophisticated ways to live entirely on land, the temnospondyls remained tied to water for at least part of their life cycle. They were exploring what you might call the amphibious path, maintaining a connection to their aquatic origins while still exploiting terrestrial opportunities. Eriops was at the more terrestrial end of the temnospondyl spectrum. It could spend significant time on land. Its bones show adaptations for supporting its weight against gravity. The shoulder and hip structures are robust, but it never fully left the water behind. And why should it? The water offered abundant food, protection from the intense heat and drought of the Permian climate, and a three-dimensional space to move through that land-dwelling predators couldn't easily access. In the swamps and rivers where Eriops hunted, it shared the water with an incredible diversity of other creatures. Primitive sharks, some with bizarre spiral-toothed jaws, cruised the deeper waters. Smaller amphibians occupied different niches, hunting different prey or living in different parts of the water system. Various fish species filled every available niche. And on the banks, feeding on the lush vegetation that grew wherever water was available, were the herbivores. Some were small and quick, others were large and well defended. All of them lived with the constant knowledge that something could be watching from just below the water's surface. Now, let's leave the swamps and rivers and travel forward in time to the late Permian. The climate has changed, the world has become drier overall, the vast swamps of the early Permian have largely disappeared, replaced by more arid environments. The herbivores that thrive in this new world have evolved impressive defenses against the predators that hunt them. Meet Scutosaurus, the shield lizard. Though calling it a lizard is misleading, Scutosaurus was a pariasaur, a member of a group of herbivorous reptiles that were only distantly related to modern lizards. They were massive, tank-like creatures, and Scutosaurus was one of the largest and most heavily armoured. Picture an animal about 10 feet long, standing about 3 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing close to 1,000 pounds. The body is barrel-shaped, packed with the massive digestive system needed to process huge quantities of tough plant material. The legs are short and thick, positioned directly under the body to support all that weight. The feet are broad and flat, spreading the animal's weight across the ground to prevent sinking into soft soil. But what really defines Scutosaurus is the armour. The entire back and sides of the animal are covered with bony plates called osteoderms. These aren't just scales, they're thick chunks of bone embedded in the skin, overlapping like tiles on a roof. On the back, the plates are largest, some over 4 inches across. Along the sides, they're smaller but more numerous. The skull is also heavily armoured. Thick bone plates cover the top and sides of the head. Small horns or spikes project from various points around the skull, particularly around the back edge. This isn't decorative. This is functional armour, designed to protect against the teeth and claws of predators. Imagine you're a Gorgonopsid hunting across the late Permian plains. You're hungry. It's been days since your last substantial meal. You spot a Scutosaurus moving slowly through a stand of seed ferns, feeding on the tough leaves. Your predatory instincts kick in. Here's a meal that could sustain you for a week. You approach carefully, using every bit of cover available. Scutosaurus might be slow, but it's not stupid. Its eyesight is decent, and it's constantly alert for danger. You get within striking distance. Your muscles coil, you charge. Scutosaurus hears you coming. There's no way to move that much weight silently across dried vegetation and loose rock, but Scutosaurus doesn't run. It can't run. Those short legs simply aren't built for speed. Instead, it does something else. It hunkers down, tucking its legs under its body as much as possible, pressing its armoured belly to the ground, and it waits. You slam into it with all your considerable force. Your jaws snap at any exposed flesh you can find, but there isn't much. Those bony plates deflect your teeth. You bite down on the armour along the back, and your teeth scrape across bone, finding no purchase. You try for the legs, but Scutosaurus is twisting, using its considerable weight to knock you off balance. Those small horns on its skull are suddenly weapons, jabbing at you as the head swings back and forth. This is not going as planned. You're expending enormous amounts of energy. The Scutosaurus is barely wounded, and then you hear it. Other Scutosaurus, drawn by the commotion, are approaching. If you get surrounded by several of these living tanks, you could get seriously injured. You make a tactical decision. You break off the attack. This meal isn't worth the risk and effort. You retreat, searching for easier prey. Scutosaurus slowly gets back to its feet and resumes feeding. Another day survived. This scenario played out countless times during the late Permian. Scutosaurus and its relatives represented a highly successful defensive strategy. Instead of relying on speed or weapons to defend against predators, they invested in armor. Heavy, expensive to grow and maintain armor, but armor that worked. The Periosaurs as a group were widespread during the late Permian. Fossils have been found in Russia, South Africa, China, and other locations that were all part of Pangea. Different species adapted to slightly different environments, but they all shared that characteristic heavy build and extensive armor. Scutosaurus itself lived primarily in what is now Russia. The environment there was relatively dry with seasonal rainfall. The vegetation consisted mainly of seed ferns, primitive conifers, and various other drought-resistant plants. Scutosaurus fed on all of these, using its broad beak to crop vegetation and its strong jaws to grind tough plant material. The teeth of Scutosaurus were small and numerous, arranged in multiple rows. As teeth wore down from constant grinding, new ones grew in to replace them. This is similar to what you see in modern herbivorous reptiles like iguanas. The jaw muscles were powerful, capable of generating the force needed to break down fibrous plant matter. Living in herds offered additional protection. A group of Scutosaurus together was an intimidating sight. Even the most confident predator would think twice about attacking multiple armored herbivores that could support each other in defense. The herd also offered more eyes watching for danger, more chances of detecting a stalking predator before it could get close enough to attack. But armor and herd behavior couldn't protect against everything. Young Scutosaurus, before their armor fully developed, were vulnerable to predation. Disease and injury could weaken even a fully armored adult, and the environment itself posed constant challenges. Drought, floods, food shortages. These were the realities of life in the late Permian, even for an animal as well defended as Scutosaurus. The Periosaurs, like Scutosaurus, were successful, but they were prey animals. Their entire existence revolved around eating enough to survive and avoiding being eaten. But what about the predators? What about the animals that hunted these armored herbivores? To truly understand the Permian, we need to meet more of the apex predators that made this world so dangerous. Let's travel to what is now Western Russia, to a time about 267 million years ago. The landscape here is a mix of open plains and scattered forest patches. It's the late Permian, and the climate is harsh. Summers are scorching hot. Winters, yes, there are winters this far from the equator of Pangea, can be surprisingly cold. This is the hunting ground of one of the most formidable predators the Permian ever produced, a creature that combined the size of Anteosaurus with hunting strategies that made it even more deadly. Titanophonius. The name means Titanic murderer. If you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you learn what this animal could do. At 16 feet long and weighing over 1,000 pounds, Titanophonius was massive, but size alone doesn't tell the full story. What made Titanophonius particularly dangerous was the combination of power, weaponry, and intelligence that it brought to every hunt. Like Anteosaurus, Titanophonius was a dinocephalian, one of those terrible-headed beasts. The skull was enormous, heavily built, with thick bones that could withstand tremendous impacts. But the skull of Titanophonius had a slightly different shape than that of Anteosaurus. It was more elongated, with a slightly narrower snout. This wasn't just a battering ram, this was a precision instrument of death. The teeth tell the story. The canines were large and dagger-shaped, perfect for piercing and holding. The teeth behind them had serrated edges, designed to saw through flesh and bone. When Titanophonius bit down, nothing escaped. The jaw muscles were phenomenally powerful, capable of crushing bones that other predators could only gnaw on. But here's what makes Titanophonius fascinating from a behavioral standpoint. The fossil evidence suggests these animals engaged in intense combat with each other, just like Anteosaurus. But the fighting style might have been different. Some paleontologists think Titanophonius may have engaged in shoving matches as much as head ramming, using their bodies and heads together to push opponents around. Picture two male Titanophonius competing for access to a territory rich in prey. They approach each other, both massive and intimidating. They might start with displays, trying to look larger, more threatening. Maybe there's vocalization involved, bellowing calls that echo across the plains. But if neither backs down, things get physical. They come together, heads lowered, and the pushing begins. Muscles straining, claws digging into the earth for purchase. It's a test of pure strength and endurance. The ground tears up beneath their feet. Dust rises around them. They might stay locked like this for minutes, each trying to force the other backward to prove dominance. Eventually, one begins to give ground. The weaker animal, or perhaps just the less motivated one, starts to back up. The victor doesn't pursue. There's no need to kill a rival that's already surrendering. Territory has been established. Dominance has been proven. But when Titanophonius hunted, there was no holding back. This was a predator that could tackle prey larger than itself, and it did so with a combination of power and strategy. The primary prey of Titanophonius was likely Scutosaurus and other heavily built herbivores. Now you might think, wait, didn't we just establish that Scutosaurus with its armor was nearly impossible to kill? And you're right for most predators, but Titanophonius wasn't most predators. Here's how a hunt might unfold. Titanophonius has located a small group of Scutosaurus. They're feeding in a dried riverbed where some tough vegetation still grows. The predator approaches from downwind, moving slowly. Despite its size, it knows how to use terrain, staying in low areas, moving when the wind rustles the vegetation to mask the sound of its approach. It gets within 50 feet, 40 feet. The Scutosaurus are still unaware. 30 feet. One of the herbivores lifts its head, sensing something, but it's too late. Titanophonius charges. Its target isn't just any Scutosaurus. It's specifically chosen one that's slightly separated from the group, one that's a bit smaller than the others. The predator is big and powerful, but it's also smart enough to choose its battles wisely. The impact when Titanophonius hits the Scutosaurus is tremendous. Over 1,000 pounds of predator moving at a fast run. The Scutosaurus is knocked completely off its feet, flipped onto its side. This is the critical moment, while the armor is nearly impenetrable on the back and sides. The belly is less protected, and right now, the belly is exposed. Those terrible jaws open wide. The teeth sink into the soft underside. Blood flows. The Scutosaurus tries to right itself, tries to get that vulnerable belly back against the ground, but Titanophonius is using its weight to keep the herbivore on its side. The other Scutosaurus in the group have fled. There's no help coming. The struggle is over quickly. Titanophonius has found the vital organs. The armor that protected Scutosaurus from so many other predators couldn't save it from an attack that combined power, speed, and tactical intelligence. This ability to bring down heavily armored prey made Titanophonius one of the most successful predators of its time and place. Fossils have been found primarily in the Mezen River basin of Russia, in rock formations that preserve a snapshot of late Permian life in that region. The ecosystem where Titanophonius lived was diverse. Besides Scutosaurus, there were numerous other herbivores, including various dicynodonts and other pariasaurs. There were smaller predators too, though none could compete with an adult Titanophonius for the largest prey. The brain case of Titanophonius shows some interesting features. The regions associated with smell were well developed, suggesting these animals could track prey over long distances. The inner ear structure suggests good hearing. These were not simple-minded eating machines. They were sophisticated predators with the sensory equipment and presumably the brain power to use complex hunting strategies. We also find evidence that Titanophonius, like other dinocephalians, may have had a relatively high metabolism. The bone structure shows signs of rapid growth and extensive blood vessel networks. This suggests an active lifestyle, an animal that could sustain activity levels higher than a typical cold-blooded reptile. But being an apex predator in the late Permian came with challenges beyond just finding food. The climate was becoming increasingly unstable, volcanic activity was increasing in various parts of Pangea, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were rising. These changes were gradual on a human timescale, taking thousands or tens of thousands of years, but they were creating stress on ecosystems. Titanophonius and the other great predators of the Permian had no way of knowing that they were living in the twilight of their world. The success they enjoyed, the dominance they held, would not last. Changes were coming that would test every adaptation, every survival strategy that evolution had produced over millions of years. But before we get to that ultimate catastrophe, there's one more Permian creature we need to meet, one that challenges our assumptions about what herbivores can be, one that proves that not all plant eaters are passive victims. Back in South Africa, sharing the landscape with Anteosaurus and later with the early Gorgonopsids, lived an animal that looked like it should be easy prey, massive, slow-moving, with no obvious weapons like horns or claws. For a long time, paleontologists classified it as just another herbivore, interesting perhaps for its size, but not particularly remarkable. They were wrong. Recent studies have revealed that this animal, Moschops, was far more complex and far more dangerous than anyone suspected. Moschops was large, there's no question about that. About 8 feet long, standing over 3 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing several hundred pounds. The body was barrel-shaped, supported on 4 thick legs that splayed out to the sides in that characteristic sprawling posture. At first glance, it looked slow and vulnerable. But look closer at the skull. Notice how thick it is. Notice the reinforcement of bone, especially across the forehead and the top of the head. Notice how the neck vertebrae are incredibly robust, designed to withstand forces coming from the front. This wasn't the skull of a passive herbivore. This was the skull of a fighter. The evidence suggests that Moschops engaged in head-ramming behaviour similar to what we see in modern bighorn sheep or musk oxen. Males would compete for territory and mates by literally smashing their heads together over and over in contests of strength and endurance. Imagine standing on a Permian plain watching 2 male Moschops square off. They start perhaps 50 feet apart, eyeing each other. Both are large, both have thick skulls that show the scars of previous battles. The tension is palpable. Then they charge. Despite that seemingly awkward, sprawling posture, they can move fast when motivated. The ground shakes under the impact of their feet. They lower their heads, aiming those reinforced skulls directly at each other. The collision when they meet is explosive. The sound carries for hundreds of yards. The force of the impact would shatter the skull of almost any other animal, but the skull of Moschops is designed specifically for this. Layers of thick bone absorb and distribute the force. Special structures in the neck vertebrae prevent injury to the spinal cord. They back up and charge again, and again and again. This might go on for an hour or more, charge after charge, each one a test of strength and will. Eventually, one animal has had enough. It turns and retreats. The victor claims the territory and the right to mate. But the ramming behaviour of Moschops wasn't just for fighting other Moschops. Those thick skulls could be used defensively against predators too. A predator expecting an easy meal from a slow herbivore might get a nasty surprise when that herbivore charges and delivers a headbutt that could crack ribs or break legs. This makes Moschops one of the most interesting herbivores of the Permian. It wasn't just passively accepting its role as prey, it had evolved an active defense mechanism, a way to fight back against the predators that threatened it. The fossil record of Moschops is remarkably complete. Dozens of specimens have been found in South Africa's Karoo Basin, some of them extraordinarily well preserved. This abundance of fossils has allowed paleontologists to study Moschops in detail, learning about its growth patterns, its variations between individuals, and its place in the ecosystem. What we've learned is fascinating. Young Moschops had thinner skulls than adults. The massive bone reinforcement developed over time, getting thicker as the animal matured. This makes sense. Young animals wouldn't engage in the same kind of intense head-ramming combat that adults did. The thick skull was something that developed as they reached sexual maturity and began competing for mates and territory. The teeth of Moschops were designed for processing tough vegetation. They weren't particularly large or sharp, but they were numerous and well suited for grinding plant material. The jaw joints allowed for a grinding motion, moving side to side as well as up and down. This is similar to what you see in modern herbivorous mammals that need to break down fibrous plant material. The body proportions tell us about lifestyle too. Those broad shoulders and thick legs supported a massive digestive system. Herbivores need large guts to extract enough nutrition from plant material, especially the tough, low-nutrition plants available in the Permian. Moschops would have spent much of its day feeding, consuming huge quantities of vegetation to fuel that large body. The environment where Moschops lived was challenging. The climate was seasonal, with distinct wet and dry periods. During the wet season, vegetation would be relatively abundant, but during the dry season, which could last for months, food would become scarce. Moschops and other herbivores would have to range widely, searching for edible plants, concentrating around the few remaining water sources. This concentration of herbivores around water during the dry season created opportunities for predators. It also increased competition between herbivores for limited resources. This is where that head-ramming behaviour would have been most important. A Moschops that could defend a good feeding territory would have a much better chance of surviving the dry season. But Moschops wasn't invulnerable. The Gorgonopsids and other large predators could still kill them, especially if they could catch a Moschops in a vulnerable position. Young Moschops, old Moschops, sick or injured Moschops, these were all potential prey. Even healthy adults could be overwhelmed if a predator was skillful or lucky enough. The evolutionary lineage that Moschops belonged to, the Dinocephalians, was diverse and successful during the middle to late Permian, but like all the dominant groups of the Permian, their time was limited. Changes were coming to the global climate and ecosystem that would challenge every species' ability to survive. Now, let's shift our focus from the land to the seas. While amazing predators stalked the Permian plains, equally strange and deadly creatures prowled the oceans. And among these marine predators, one stands out as perhaps the most bizarre, most uniquely adapted shark that has ever existed. Its name is Helicoprion, and for over a century after its discovery, scientists argued about what this animal even looked like. The problems started with the first fossils discovered. They consisted of a strange spiral structure made of teeth, just teeth, arranged in a whirl like a circular saw blade. No skull, no body, just this bizarre tooth whirl, and nobody could figure out where on the animal it was supposed to go. Some early reconstructions put it on the snout, sticking forward like a narwhal's tusk. Others thought it might be on the tail, a defensive weapon, or maybe a tool for stirring up bottom sediments. Some truly creative ideas placed it on the dorsal fin, or even suggested multiple whirls on different parts of the body. It wasn't until modern technology, specifically CT scanning and computer modelling, became available that scientists finally solved the mystery. The tooth whirl belonged in the lower jaw. It was a feeding apparatus unlike anything else in nature. Here's how it worked. As Helicoprion grew, it didn't shed its teeth the way most sharks do. Instead, new teeth grew at the front of the jaw, and older teeth were pushed back and down into the spiral. The result was a continuously growing whirl of teeth, with the newest, sharpest teeth at the outer edge and the oldest teeth at the center of the spiral. When Helicoprion closed its mouth, this tooth whirl would rotate slightly inward, drawing prey into the mouth while the teeth sliced and crushed. It was like a combination of a conveyor belt and a meat grinder, all built into the jaw of a shark. Helicoprion could grow large. The biggest specimens suggest animals up to 13 feet long, maybe even larger. The body was probably similar to a modern shark, streamlined and powerful, built for efficient swimming. But that jaw, that incredible specialized jaw, set it apart from every other predator in the ocean. What did Helicoprion eat? The tooth whirl suggests prey that needed to be gripped and crushed rather than just cut. Likely candidates include cephalopods, the ancestors of modern squids and octopuses. These soft-bodied animals with internal shells or primitive external shells would have been perfect prey for Helicoprion's unique feeding apparatus. Picture the hunt. We're in the Permian Ocean, swimming above a seafloor about 300 feet down. The water is clear here, far from the sediment-laden rivers flowing off Pangea. Schools of primitive fish dart through the water, constantly alert for danger. And somewhere in the blue shadows beyond the limits of vision, Helicoprion is hunting. It detects a school of cephalopods through a combination of senses. The slight electrical fields their bodies generate are picked up by sensory organs on Helicoprion's snout, similar to the ampullae of Lorenzini that modern sharks use. The movement of the water as the cephalopods swim creates pressure waves that Helicoprion's lateral line system can detect. The shark turns and accelerates. Its powerful tail propels it forward with smooth, efficient strokes. It's not the fastest shark in the Permian seas, but it's fast enough. The cephalopods see it coming and scatter, but Helicoprion has already selected its targets. One individual, slightly slower than the others, or maybe one that zigged when it should have zagged. The gap closes. Helicoprion's mouth opens and that bizarre tooth whirl is revealed. The cephalopod tries one last desperate evasion maneuver, but it's too late. The jaws close around it and the tooth whirl does its work. The teeth grip and crush, the spiral action pulling the prey deeper into the mouth. In seconds, it's over. Helicoprion swallows its meal and continues hunting. It needs to eat regularly to fuel that active, possibly warm-blooded or at least regionally endothermic metabolism that allows it to be such an effective predator. Helicoprion wasn't alone in the Permian oceans. It shared the water with a diverse array of other sharks, many of them equally strange by modern standards. There were sharks with bizarre tooth arrangements, sharks with spines, sharks of every size from tiny to enormous. This was a golden age for shark diversity, and Helicoprion was one of the most successful forms. Fossils of Helicoprion have been found worldwide. Specimens have been discovered in North America, Russia, Australia, and other locations. During the Permian, these areas were all connected through the global ocean that surrounded Pangea. Helicoprion could range widely, following the migrations of its prey species. The evolutionary lineage Helicoprion belonged to, the Eugenodontids, were experimenting with tooth arrangements. Different genera had different variations on the whirl theme. Some had tighter spirals, some had looser ones, some had larger teeth, some had smaller, more numerous teeth. Each variation was testing a slightly different feeding strategy. But evolution is not a straight path toward perfection. It's a continuous process of adaptation to changing conditions, and the conditions in the Permian world were about to change dramatically. The late Permian period saw increasing volcanic activity. In what is now Siberia, massive volcanic eruptions were pumping enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere: carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, other compounds that would affect the global climate. The ocean chemistry was beginning to shift too, becoming more acidic as it absorbed atmospheric carbon dioxide. For animals like Helicoprion, these changes were creating stress. The ocean food chains were disrupted as the chemistry changed. Prey species were affected, which in turn affected predators. The changes were gradual, happening over thousands of years, but they were relentless. Marine reptiles were also beginning to diversify and compete with sharks for food resources. These reptiles, distant relatives of the synapsids we've been discussing, were adapting to life in the ocean. Some were becoming efficient fish eaters, some were exploring other niches. The world that had allowed Helicoprion to thrive for millions of years was transforming, and as successful as this bizarre shark had been, as perfectly adapted as its unique tooth whorl was for its lifestyle, it would not be able to adapt quickly enough to what was coming. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we reach the catastrophe that ended the Permian, there are still more creatures to meet, more ecosystems to explore. The Permian world was vast and diverse, and every corner of it held unique and fascinating life forms. Let's return to the rivers and wetlands, but move forward in time to the late Permian. The geography has shifted. What were once extensive swamps in some regions have dried up, but new wetland systems have formed in other areas. In what will one day be Siberia, a network of rivers and floodplains creates pockets of lush life in an otherwise increasingly arid world. Here lives another amphibian giant, a temnospondyle that rivals Eriops in size and deadliness, but has evolved its own unique approach to predation. Platyoposaurus. The name means flat-faced lizard, and once again, the lizard part is misleading. This is an amphibian, a relative of modern frogs and salamanders, but far larger and far more fearsome than any amphibian alive today. At up to 8 feet in length, Platyoposaurus was a heavyweight predator in its aquatic environment. The skull was broad and flat, over 16 inches long in large adults, with eyes positioned on top where they could watch the world above while the rest of the body remained submerged. This is the classic ambush predator design, refined over millions of years of evolution. The jaws were lined with numerous conical teeth, each one sharp as a needle. Like Eriops, Platyoposaurus also had palatal teeth on the roof of its mouth, creating that inescapable cage for any prey unfortunate enough to be caught. But the skull of Platyoposaurus was even flatter than that of Eriops, more specialized for life in the water. The body behind that massive head was thick and muscular. Short, powerful legs allowed movement on land, but this was primarily an aquatic animal. The tail was the main propulsion system in water, flattening from side to side to provide maximum thrust with each stroke. The lifestyle of Platyoposaurus would have been one of patient waiting, punctuated by explosive violence. Imagine a late Permian river in Siberia. The wet season has just ended. The water level is dropping slowly, but there's still plenty of depth in the main channel. The banks are muddy, soft from months of flooding. Vegetation grows thick wherever the water has receded slowly enough to allow roots to establish. Platyoposaurus has found a perfect ambush point. Where a smaller tributary meets the main river, there's a depression in the riverbed, a pool about 6 feet deep. The water here is murky, brown with suspended sediment. Perfect. The amphibian settles into this pool, wedging itself into the mud and aquatic vegetation. Only its eyes and the tip of its snout remain above the mud line. Everything else is hidden, and then it waits. Hours pass. The sun moves across the sky. Small fish come and go. Platyoposaurus doesn't move. It's waiting for something bigger. As afternoon turns toward evening, the larger prey begins to appear. A group of primitive reptiles comes down to the river to drink. They're cautious, alert for the Gorgonopsids and other terrestrial predators that hunt these riverbanks, but they're focused on threats from the land. They don't see the danger lurking just below the water's surface. One reptile wades into the shallows, lowering its head to drink. It's now standing in water about a foot deep, right at the edge of the deeper pool where Platyoposaurus waits. The distance between predator and prey is less than 6 feet. The attack is sudden and shocking. Platyoposaurus lunges out of the water with its mouth already gaping wide. The massive jaws snap shut around the reptile's midsection. Those hundreds of teeth pierce from all sides. The victim doesn't even have time to scream before it's dragged under. In the water, Platyoposaurus's power is overwhelming. It performs what's called a death roll, spinning rapidly while holding the prey firmly in its jaws. This technique, also used by modern crocodiles, serves multiple purposes. It disorients the prey, prevents it from getting any leverage to escape, and helps tear off chunks of flesh if the prey is too large to swallow whole. In this case, the prey is small enough to be swallowed after it stops struggling. Platyoposaurus releases the death roll and positions the body headfirst in its mouth. The backward-angled teeth make it impossible for the prey to slip back out. A series of powerful gulps, and the meal disappears down the throat. Platyoposaurus won't need to eat again for days, maybe even a week if this meal was substantial enough. It returns to its ambush position and settles back into the mud. Life in the Permian continues around it, oblivious to the deadly predator in their midst. The temnospondal amphibians, of which both Eriops and Platyoposaurus were members, represented one of the great success stories of Permian evolution. They had colonized freshwater environments across Pangea, evolving into dozens of different forms, each adapted to slightly different ecological niches. Some were fully aquatic, never leaving the water. Others, like Eriops, were more amphibious. A few were even reasonably terrestrial, though they never lost their connection to water entirely. But the late Permian climate was becoming less friendly to amphibians. The increasing aridity meant fewer permanent water bodies. Many rivers became seasonal, flowing only during the brief wet season and drying to scattered pools or disappearing entirely during the long dry season. For animals that needed water for reproduction, for moisture on their skin, for hunting, these changes posed serious challenges. Still, the temnospondals persisted. They had been around for tens of millions of years and had survived climate fluctuations before. Many species adapted to the changing conditions, becoming more tolerant of temporary droughts, more efficient at exploiting shrinking water resources. Now, let's shift our focus from the giants to something smaller but no less fascinating. Not every Permian predator was a massive, terrifying monster. Some were more modestly sized but represented important steps in the evolution of the lineage that would eventually produce mammals. Meet Pristinathus, a therocephalian synapsid that lived in the late Permian of what is now South Africa. At about 5 feet in length, Pristinathus was small compared to the giants we've been discussing, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in sophistication. Therocephalians were an advanced group of carnivorous synapsids. The name means beast head, referring to their somewhat mammal-like skulls. Pristinathus showed a mix of primitive reptilian features and more advanced mammalian traits, a perfect example of evolution in action. The skull was elongated and relatively narrow, built for quick, precise bites rather than crushing power. The teeth were differentiated into different types, with prominent canines in front and smaller cutting teeth behind. This heterodonty, as we discussed earlier, is a key mammalian characteristic. But here's what makes Pristinathus particularly interesting. The eye sockets were positioned to face somewhat forward, providing better binocular vision than most Permian predators. This forward-facing vision allowed for better depth perception, crucial for a predator that hunted with precision rather than overwhelming power. The body was built for agility. The legs were positioned more directly under the body than in more primitive synapsids, allowing for more efficient running. The spine was flexible, allowing the animal to twist and turn quickly. This wasn't a predator that would charge headlong at armored herbivores. This was a hunter of smaller, faster prey. Imagine a Pristinathus hunting in the late Permian scrublands of South Africa. The landscape is harsh, rocky outcrops scattered among tough, drought-resistant vegetation. The dry season is in full force. Most animals are concentrated around the few remaining water sources, but Pristinathus has learned that the areas between water sources can offer hunting opportunities. Small reptiles and synapsids, forced to travel between water and feeding areas, become vulnerable during these journeys. Pristinathus patrols these routes, using its keen eyesight and sense of smell to detect potential prey. Movement catches its attention. A small dicynodont, perhaps 1.5 feet long, is moving through a patch of seed ferns. It's trying to stay hidden, but Pristinathus has spotted it. The predator freezes, lowering its body close to the ground. Those forward-facing eyes lock onto the target, calculating distance and angle. The stalk begins. Pristinathus moves with careful precision, placing each foot silently. The tail provides balance, allowing for smooth, controlled movement. 10 feet away, 8 feet. The dicynodont is still unaware, focused on finding edible leaves. 6 feet. Pristinathus coils its body like a spring. 4 feet. The dicynodont hears something, starts to turn. Too late. Pristinathus covers the final distance in an explosive burst of speed. The jaws snap shut on the dicynodon's neck. Those sharp canines pierce vital blood vessels. The victim struggles for a moment, but Pristinathus has a firm grip. The struggle weakens and stops. Unlike the massive predators that needed to make kills last for days or weeks, Pristinathus had a faster metabolism. It needed to hunt more frequently, maybe every day or every other day, but this smaller, more active lifestyle had advantages. Pristinathus could survive in areas that couldn't support the giant predators. It could exploit prey resources that the big predators ignored. The Therocephalians as a group were diverse and successful in the late Permian. Different species evolved different hunting strategies and occupied different niches. Some were larger than Pristinathus, approaching the size of a large dog. Others were smaller, cat-sized predators of small prey. Together they formed an important part of the Permian food web. And importantly for the story of life on Earth, the Therocephalians were evolving traits that would later characterize mammals. The differentiated teeth, the increasingly upright posture, the hints of a higher metabolism, all pointed toward the direction evolution was taking the synapsid lineage. The brain of Pristinathus, while still small by mammalian standards, showed developments in the regions associated with sensory processing and coordination. This was an animal with better reflexes, better motor control, better ability to track and catch agile prey than its more primitive ancestors. The fossil sites where Pristinathus has been found preserve an incredible snapshot of late Permian life in South Africa. Multiple species from different ecological niches are found together, allowing paleontologists to reconstruct the entire ecosystem. We can see what Pristinathus hunted it, what it competed with, what shared its environment. And what these fossil sites also show is change. The rock layers can be dated, allowing scientists to track how the ecosystem evolved over time. And in the latest Permian layers, things are starting to look different. Some species disappear from the record, others become less common. New species appear, often more tolerant of harsh conditions. The world is changing. The relatively stable climate of the middle Permian is giving way to something more chaotic. Volcanic eruptions are becoming more frequent and more severe. The atmosphere is changing composition. The oceans are absorbing this changed atmosphere and responding in ways that ripple through the entire food chain. For an animal like Pristinathus, these changes mean new challenges. Prey species are becoming scarcer as plant life is affected by the changing climate. Competition with other predators intensifies as everyone struggles for limited resources. The comfortable niches that species had evolved to fill over millions of years are starting to disappear. But the therocephalians, including Pristinathus, are adaptable. They've shown the ability to evolve and adjust to changing conditions before. As the late Permian progresses, we see them diversifying, experimenting with new forms and new strategies. Some become more specialized, others become more generalist, able to eat a wider variety of food. This adaptability would prove crucial because what's coming will test every species' ability to survive like never before in Earth's history. The changes that have been building slowly are about to accelerate into catastrophe. The end came from beneath the Earth itself. In what is now Siberia, a region that would one day be covered in frozen tundra, the ground began to tear itself apart. This wasn't a single volcano erupting. This was something far more massive, far more catastrophic. The Siberian Traps, a volcanic event so enormous that it defies comprehension. Over the course of perhaps a few 100,000 years, maybe even less, these eruptions poured out enough lava to cover an area the size of the continental United States to a depth of hundreds of feet. But it wasn't the lava that killed the world, it was what came with it. Gases, unimaginable quantities of gases released into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane from burning coal deposits. The sky itself changed colour, turned red and grey with ash and chemical reactions. The sun became a dim orange disk struggling to penetrate the haze. The carbon dioxide acted like a blanket, trapping heat. Global temperatures began to rise. In the oceans, this warming had a terrifying effect. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water. As the oceans heated, oxygen levels dropped. Marine life began to suffocate in water that could no longer support them. But it got worse. The oceans absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and this triggered a chemical change. The water became more acidic. Animals with shells or external skeletons found their protective coverings dissolving. Entire groups of organisms, from tiny plankton to large-shelled cephalopods, were dying. On land, the rising temperatures created new problems. The interior of Pangea, already arid, became even drier. Drought intensified. Forests died back. The plants that herbivores depended on withered and disappeared. And when the herbivores died, the predators that hunted them starved. The sulfur dioxide mixed with water in the atmosphere to create sulfuric acid. Acid rain fell across Pangea, poisoning what water sources remained, burning vegetation, making the soil toxic. Places that had been habitable became wastelands, and still the volcanoes erupted year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The gases kept coming, the temperature kept rising, the oxygen levels in both air and water kept dropping. For the creatures we've been following, this was an apocalypse beyond imagination. Let's visit them one last time, see how they faced the end of their world. The Gorgonopsids, those saber-toothed terrors that had ruled the late Permian plains, found their hunting grounds transformed into dust bowls. The herbivores they depended on were dying off, weakened by starvation and unable to find water. A Gorgonopsid might track a herd of Dimetrodons for days, only to find them already dead, killed by heat and thirst. Even when prey could be found, the extreme temperatures made hunting dangerous. A Gorgonopsid in pursuit of prey might overheat and collapse before making the kill. The nights brought little relief. The trapped heat in the atmosphere kept temperatures elevated even after sunset. As prey became scarcer, Gorgonopsids turned on each other. Cannibalism became common. The social structures that may have existed, the family groups and hunting packs, broke down. It became every individual for itself, and one by one they died. The last Gorgonopsid, alone in a dying world, searching for food that no longer existed, finally succumbed. Anteosaurus and Titanophonius and the other dinocephalians were already gone. They had disappeared before the very end, victims of the earlier climate changes that preceded the main extinction event. The niches they had occupied were taken over by the Gorgonopsids and other predators. But in a way, they were the lucky ones. They didn't have to witness the total collapse. Moschops and the other herbivorous dinocephalians faced starvation as the plants they depended on died. That thick skull that had served so well in combat with rivals couldn't help against drought and heat. The last Moschops stood in what had once been a feeding ground, now just bare, cracked earth. There was nothing left to eat, nothing left to drink. The species that had been so successful, so well adapted to their environment, discovered that when the environment changes fast enough, no adaptation is sufficient. In the rivers and lakes, Eriops and Platyoposaurus watched their aquatic refuges shrink. Permanent rivers became seasonal streams. Seasonal streams dried up entirely. The temnospondyls tried to adapt, some burrowing into mud to wait out the drought, but the drought never ended. Ponds that had existed for thousands of years evaporated. The fish and other prey died. And without prey, without water, the great amphibians followed them into extinction. Scutosaurus and the other pariasaurs, with all their impressive armour, found that you can't armour yourself against starvation and heat. As the vegetation disappeared, these massive herbivores had nowhere to turn. Some fossil sites show Scutosaurus remains clustered around dried-up waterholes. Dozens of individuals that came seeking water and found only death. In the oceans, Helicoprion faced a different but equally lethal set of challenges. The dropping oxygen levels affected its prey species first. The cephalopods and fish that it hunted were dying off, unable to breathe in the oxygen-depleted water. Helicoprion, with its higher metabolism and greater oxygen needs, struggled to survive in the changed ocean. The acidification of the oceans added another layer of stress. While Helicoprion itself, as a cartilaginous fish, wasn't directly affected by the acid, its prey species were. Animals with shells found their protective coverings dissolving. The entire marine food web was collapsing from the bottom up. In the end, it didn't matter how well adapted you were, how successfully you had evolved, how long your lineage had survived. The Permian Triassic extinction event, later known as the Great Dying, killed approximately 90% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. It was the closest life on Earth has ever come to total annihilation. The die-off took perhaps 60,000 years. That sounds like a long time, but in geological terms, it's the blink of an eye. Species that had existed for millions of years disappeared in what amounted to an instant. Ecosystems that had been stable for eons collapsed and reformed and collapsed again. The synapsids, that great lineage that had produced Dimetrodon and the Gorgonopsids and Moschops and so many others, were devastated. Most families went extinct. Most genera vanished. The diversity that had taken tens of millions of years to evolve was erased in less than 100,000. but life is remarkably persistent. Even in the midst of the greatest catastrophe Earth has ever known, some species survived. They were the lucky ones, or perhaps the best adapted ones, or perhaps just the ones that happened to be in the right place at the right time, but they survived. Among the survivors were some small, unassuming synapsids. They weren't the apex predators, they weren't the giants, they were the opportunists, the generalists, the ones that could eat a variety of foods and survive in harsh conditions. These survivors would go on to evolve into the cynodonts and eventually into true mammals. Also among the survivors were some early archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs and crocodiles and birds. They were small and relatively rare in the late Permian, overshadowed by the dominant synapsids, but in the aftermath of the extinction, with the niches left empty by the dead, they had room to evolve and diversify. The world that emerged from the extinction was strange and empty. Ecosystems were simplified with far fewer species than before. It took millions of years for diversity to recover, for the empty niches to be refilled, for complex food webs to re-establish. The Triassic period that followed the Permian was in many ways a time of experimentation and recovery. New groups of animals evolved to fill the roles that had been occupied by the Permian giants. The archosaurs diversified rapidly, producing the first dinosaurs and the ancestors of modern crocodiles. The synapsids, though greatly reduced from their Permian glory, didn't disappear. Those survivors continued to evolve, becoming more and more mammal-like with each passing million years. The cynodonts developed more advanced jaws, more complex teeth, probably fur and lactation. By the late Triassic, the first true mammals had appeared. But these early mammals were small, living in the shadows of the dinosaurs that now dominated the land. The age of the giant synapsids was over. The dinocephalians, the Gorgonopsids, all the impressive predators and herbivores we've met were gone forever. Their ecological roles were taken over by dinosaurs. Yet the legacy of the Permian monsters lives on. Every mammal alive today, including you, is descended from those small synapsids that survived the Great Dying. The adaptations that allowed them to survive, the metabolic flexibility, the diverse dentition, the increasingly sophisticated nervous systems, these became the foundation for mammalian evolution. When the dinosaurs themselves went extinct 66 million years ago, it was the descendants of those Permian survivors that rose to fill the empty niches. Mammals diversified and spread across the planet, eventually producing everything from whales to bats to primates to humans. So when you look at your dog or cat, when you watch wildlife documentaries about lions or elephants, remember that you're looking at the distant descendants of the Permian synapsids. The genetic legacy of Dimetrodon and Anteosaurus and all the others flows through every mammal alive. The Permian period teaches us important lessons about life on Earth. It shows us that dominance is temporary. The Gorgonopsids ruled their world completely, and then they were gone. It shows us that even the most successful adaptations can become liabilities. When the environment changes rapidly enough, the massive size and specialized hunting techniques that made Anteosaurus an apex predator couldn't save it when there was nothing left to hunt. It also shows us the incredible resilience of life. Even after the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, life not only survived but eventually thrived again. New forms evolved, new ecosystems developed. The planet recovered, though it took millions of years. The monsters of the Permian walked a world that we can barely imagine, a world of vast supercontinents and extreme climates, a world of incredible diversity and constant struggle. They were some of the most successful animals ever to live, ruling their ecosystems for tens of millions of years. And then they were gone, victims of changes beyond their control, beyond their ability to adapt to quickly enough. But their story isn't one of failure. It's a story of success, of evolution, pushing the boundaries of what's possible, of life exploiting every available niche and opportunity. These creatures deserve to be remembered and celebrated, not as primitive failures, but as sophisticated, successful animals that dominated their world just as completely as any dinosaur would later dominate the Mesozoic. They were the true monsters of deep time, and their legacy is written in every mammal's DNA. The next time someone mentions dinosaurs, tell them about the Permian. Tell them about creatures just as impressive, just as fearsome, just as worthy of attention and awe. Tell them about Dimetrodon with its magnificent sail, about the Gorgonopsids with their saber fangs, about Anteosaurus with its skull built for ramming, about Helicoprion with its spiral of teeth. These animals existed. They lived and hunted and fought and survived for millions of years, and though they're gone now, lost to time and catastrophe, their story reminds us of both the incredible power of evolution and the fragility of life in the face of rapid environmental change. A lesson that feels increasingly relevant as we face our own era of climate transformation. The Permian monsters are extinct, but their legacy endures, and their story, finally being told after being hidden for so long in the shadow of the dinosaurs, is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of life on Earth.